Janie Chang's historical novels have been Canadian national bestsellers and nominated for international literary awards. Her upcoming novel, The Porcelain Moon, which, by the way, isn't even released till next week, and we got permission from her publisher, so you guys are the first people to get copies and to get it signed and to hear her talk. So, set in World War I France, and, oh, I already read the rest of that. So, welcome, Janie. Sorry, it's getting late. Eliza is an award-winning and USA Today best-selling author. She is the creator of the popular historical blog History Undressed and a co-host on the History, Books, and Wine podcast. Books and Wine. Yeah. Her book, The Mayfair Bookshop, is a brilliant dual narrative story about Nancy Mitford, one of 1930s London's hottest socialites, authors, and a member of the scandalous Mitford sisters, as well as a modern American desperate for a change, connected through time by a little London bookshop. Welcome, Eliza. Madeline Martin, to my immediate left, is a New York Times and international best-selling author of The Last Bookshop in London. Her moving new novel, The Librarian Spy, is inspired by the true history of America's library spies of World War II. Ava thought her job as a librarian at the Library of Congress would mean a quiet, routine existence, but an unexpected offer from a U.S. military has brought her to Lisbon with a new mission, posing as a librarian while working undercover as a spy gathering intelligence. So juicy. Welcome, Madeline. And last but certainly not least, and you'll see she just joined us, so for those of you who missed her earlier in the day, always a favorite, Kristina McMorris is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling author of 2 novellas and 7 novels, including the million copy bestseller Sold on a Monday, which copies are out there available if you want to be 1,000,001. Previously, she hosted weekly television shows beginning at age 9 with an Emmy Award-winning program. Inspired by stunning true accounts, her novels have garnered more than 24 prestigious awards and nominations. Her new book, the international bestseller The Ways We Hide, was named Target's top 5 reads of 2022 and features a World War II illusionist recruited by British intelligence to help thwart the Germans. Welcome, Kristina. All righty, let me get to my questions here. Okay. The panel, it's top secret. You all write about secrets of some kind in your most recent novels. Tell us about the secrets in your books, how you discovered them, and why you decided to tell them. Kristina.
So good to see you all. I have a lot of friends here. It's nice to see you all, and thanks for letting me kind of slide in late. And I will apologize for those I haven't got to talk to you at my table without going on a long time. Just there was a family medical issue, and so that prevented me from coming earlier. So I apologize for not being here, but I'm happy to be here now. As far as top secret goes, where the story came from that involves World War II and the secrets that I came across that I thought, this is so crazy, stranger than fiction, we have to share this, was I went to my desperation folder, that's what I call it. I put in ideas of stories that I'm always terrified I will never come up with another good story idea for the rest of my life. So I go to my desperation folder, and I looked in there one day, and there were 2 things I put in years ago. One was an article that was titled, How Monopoly Helped the Allies Win World War II. And I thought, well, that is just so cool. It's such a cool fun fact where they smuggled tools that helped Allied POWs escape into Monopoly boards and everything else you can think of, and they put them in care packages for the Allied POWs. Now, this was kept classified because it worked so well, they thought they might have to use it against the Russians during the Cold War. So it was kept classified to about 1985. So that was in my folder, and right next to it was an image of children that had perished in something called the Italian Hall disaster in Michigan's Copper Country. It was all stemmed from a false cry of fire that created a stampede down the stairwell. And it all happened on Christmas Eve, and I thought, how did we not hear about that before either? So right then, that night that I saw the 2 together, immediately in my head, I realized that my character was a survivor of that stampede. She would need always 2 ways out of every room in order to escape, and Houdini would become her idol. And so because of that, she is recruited by MI9, who helped create all these tools and used illusionists to create tools to help them all escape. And in about 15 minutes, I had 2/3 of the novel in my head, and it was like a movie, and I wrote it down.
So with The Librarian Spy, I read an article, because I'm like a totally self-professed history nerd and research nerd. I can't help myself, I love it all. And so I read articles for fun, because that's what history nerds do. And I happened upon this one article that was talking about librarian spies. And these librarian spies were from America, and they were sent to neutral countries to gather intel to help with like the Allies and gathering information on the Nazis. So it would be pamphlets, it could be textbooks, etc. So they would send these librarians to these neutral countries, but they really wouldn't actually give them any training. They would just kind of send them over there. And I thought, if I ever was going to be a spy, that would probably be me, because I don't think I would do well with training. And so, so once they would go to these neutral countries, like for example with Lisbon, 007's, oh goodness, now the name like escapes me. One of his popular books actually stemmed in Lisbon. And so that'll give you an idea of incredibly how these spies were just super consummate spies. I'm so sorry, I seriously woke up at like 3 o'clock this morning, so my brain is fading so hard right now. East Coast brain. But so, I wish I could remember the title. So basically, they were surrounded by all these consummate spies and really struggled with it. And the other part of the book is set in France, and where that comes from is I would love to say that every single story idea that we pitch to our agents and editors, they accept. Sadly, that is not the case, but we do still get to use some of our research for other books. So this was one that I happened to read about in France, about a woman who worked with the French resistance putting together the clandestine newspapers, which was an incredibly dangerous job. And her story was so incredibly fascinating to me that I thought, oh, well, if I have somebody who is finding these clandestine papers, what better to put her with than somebody who's creating these clandestine newspapers? And so between these two women is where the idea for The Librarian Spy came from.
Good, thank you. Janie,
I hope this is working. Is it working?
so can you hear? Yeah.
All right, so there are sort of, in terms of secrets, there's one thing which is the real world secret, a secret history that's kind of vanished from the historical record, and then there's the secrets that I wrote into the book. The secret history that somehow vanished, I came across when I was doing research, as history nerds do, for another book, and came across the story from a UK newspaper that talked about the city of Liverpool was raising a monument to honor the 140,000 Chinese workers who went to First World War France and England to help with the war effort. And right now, all of you, just like me, are saying, what 140,000 Chinese workers that went to France and England? So I thought, I need to get back to this when I finished working on my current novel. And it was true, and that it inspired me, it kind of enraged me, it was just totally mystifying to me because, you know, we write about, you've got the librarian spies, you've got individuals who have been swept under the carpet of history, but how do you sweep under the carpet of history that many men and the governments that were involved? Okay, so against the backdrop of this history, I also thought, you know, what kind of people could I put into a novel? I know that I want a Chinese perspective on it simply because what would someone who is Chinese living in France feel and think and know about these workers? And so I was reading about the history of some of these workers, and some of them, not that many, of the 140,000, maybe 2,000 stayed behind in France, and because they had fallen in love with and married French women while they were there, and even to this day, some of their descendants are not very clear on, you know, where the history of their grandfathers. So I thought, and what would happen in a society where such a thing might have been kind of not maybe forbidden, but would be, what would people think, right? So there's a secret love affair in this story, which is about a young Chinese woman who's living in Paris, and she's working in her uncle's antique store, but she's also illegitimate and an orphan, and her uncle's about to have her have an arranged marriage for her, where she would need to go back to China and leave her beloved Paris. The other character in the book is a young French woman who is in an abusive marriage, and she has a secret. She has a couple of secrets, and their paths cross, and they help each other, but they also put each other in greater danger.
Hello. So my book is also full of secrets, some of which are made up and some of which are real. For example, in the sections of the book that are about Nancy Mitford, she was recruited during World War II to inform on her sisters, two of which were very involved in various fascist movements. One was the rumored lover of Hitler, and the other one was secretly married to the leader of the BUF in London, which was the British Union of Fascists, and Hitler was a guest at their wedding secretly. So there's those types of secrets. And Nancy, while she was informing on her sisters, and while she was alive, never told them that she was doing that, even after the war was over, and in fact became quite close with one of those sisters. And it wasn't until she passed away that one of the other sisters in the family told her, hey, by the way, she spied on you during World War II. And her sister was quite surprised by that. The other thing that I liked to explore during this book was also the secrets we keep from our friends, our family, and even from ourselves. Nancy had a lot of that, where she was sort of presenting herself as one person to everyone in public, and even presenting herself as something that she wanted to be for herself, but she wasn't. So there's all of that. And then I have a fictional story that is exploring sort of sadness and relationships. My heroine's mother has recently passed away, and the whole time she was growing up, they were trying to discover the secret of this person who was a friend of Nancy's, and Nancy had left an inscription for her in her novel. And her mother, when she passes away, gives her a little packet of letters that Nancy had written between friends. And in the opening of each chapter in the book, there is a letter that Nancy's written back and forth to friends or sisters, things like that, which I have to say, I always tell this to everyone when I'm talking, I actually wrote those letters, because a lot of people are like, I can't believe they let you print her letters. I'm like, no, I wrote all those. So those are all the secrets.
Thank you. And a lot of you have asked us what the black N with the Novel Network logo is above some of the authors' names. That means they are a member of our service called Novel Network. And Novel Network we launched right before COVID started, of course. And the goal was to connect book clubs with readers so that readers would only have to go to one website. They could view our database we have over 150 author members now. You can view their calendar online. You can book them for a book club visit right there on the spot. Almost all of them do 30-minute sessions for free, and pennies, after that for longer or larger book clubs. So you can check out novelnetwork.com, which I hesitate to say that because we are actually merging with Adventures by the Book, so it'll soon become one service. But I wanted to mention that because so many people have asked us, and also because my next question has to do with book clubs, because these four authors are very popular book club authors. And so I want to know a little bit about what it is that you like book clubs, librarians, reading groups to ask you, to talk to you about when you're meeting with book clubs. What do you get out of it? What does it mean to you? And can you talk a little bit about your book club experiences? Maybe we'll start with you, Madeline.
Speaking of books, I remember the title now, and it's Casino Royale. We can think so much better when we don't have a microphone in our hands. Book clubs are just such magical places, honestly. I'm part of a neighborhood book club. We actually are kind of a wine club that also happens to read books. But one of the wonderful things about book clubs is it really is just coming together with what we all love, and that's books. And especially, when we create these books, we put so much of our heart and so much of our soul into it, and a lot of research. And so knowing that people have taken time out of their busy days to spend a little bit of that time in our head, in our worlds that we've created for them, it's such a precious experience. And getting to talk to them and let them sort of pick our brains, like, why did you do this? Why did you kill this one person? Whatever the case may be, and getting to explain our reasoning behind it. It's just really such an intimate connection with people for them to be able to understand on the level that you created that book. Just in addition to that, especially as a history lover and how much work we put into all of our stories, having them ask questions about the historical detail that inspired certain scenes, or, oh, did this really exist? It's so cool to see that. And every time I find out that somebody has been inspired to research an event in history because of having read it in my book, y'all, it makes my heart just go pitter-patter.
Thank you, Kristina.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, we love book clubs. And I do call them wine clubs with books. I do remember years ago I went to a book club in person. These days, thank goodness, get to do a lot more book clubs because of Zoom, one of the upsides of the pandemic. And I remember sitting down at the book club and we talked for hours and it was so much fun. And at the end they said, that was so much fun. That was fun to actually talk about the book. I said, we rarely do that. And I thought, well, yeah, that's why I'm here. So anyway, really fun. I love also I always throw in recipes usually in the back of my book. So I will say, this is word of the wise among the authors, don't ever put a recipe in the back of the book for book clubs that you don't love. Because I have been fed so much of the carrot pie over and over again from my book club recipes. I love book clubs especially because I think we all love them for this reason. It pushes people outside of your comfort zone of books that you would normally pick up, and you realize that you love another genre that you never would have picked up. I hear that all the time. And then also it brings up topics that probably shouldn't always be brought up at cocktail parties and among friends, but it pushes you to talk about the hard topics and help grow. And empathy, I think, is the biggest thing that we gain from that.
Thank you. Eliza?
So I agree with everything these ladies have said. In addition to that, as far as recipes goes, I love to also include a drink. So my book club guide for my book and a couple of my other books always have like a signature drink to have at your book club. For this book, it's a French 75. Love French 75. But the other fun thing, because I think all of us can probably agree with this, is that when we're researching our books, we come across some amazing fun facts, and we can't put all of them in the book. So if someone says, what's a fun fact you learned that you couldn't put in the book, or what's a fun fact that spurred you to do another story, we love to share that kind of stuff because it's not something that you would have read in the book, and it still pertains to the book. So I like to share that. Or deleted scenes, stuff that we poured our hearts into and wrote, and then the editor was like, slash that. We really like to share those too.
Thank you.
Well, never mind the recipe at the back for, always getting these strange offerings from book clubs. In the days before Novel Network started organizing my book clubs, and people would email me directly through my website, and I had this perfectly nice correspondence with someone on the west side of Vancouver, very, very wealthy neighborhood, and I get there, and we're having a perfectly lovely time, and then at the end of it, they said, oh, and at the end of our book clubs, we always go into the hot tub. No, I think I need to go home now. I'm still at that stage. This is my fourth book. I'm still at that stage where I can't believe that people want to read my book, let alone want to get together and talk about it. And I'm just incredibly gratified. And I always feel that I get more out of it than the readers do because readers say, wow, I really enjoyed hearing the background or the family history behind the book or something. But I just love to hear how the book has affected someone else, what memories it brings up, and what it encourages them to share within the group and with me. And I would say the worst thing about book clubs is they will also say, have you read this particular title? And, you know, there'll be 90 seconds of excited talk, and my TBR stat goes up again.
Thank you. So I want to talk about your current books. I know you've all mentioned bits and pieces of them, but I'd like you to share a little bit about the story behind your book, as much as you want to share without giving too much away and what you haven't already talked about. So maybe we'll start on this end this time with Eliza.
I hate going first. So what is my book about? My book is about Nancy Mitford and her sisters, and basically it's called The Mayfair Bookshop, and then there's a semicolon that says Nancy Mitford and the Pursuit of Happiness, because through her life, she was not a particularly very happy person. She didn't feel that her parents provided her with an education that was what she wanted, and she didn't get along very well with all of her siblings all the time. She had a really rough relationship with her mother. Her fiance for 5 years, she thought they were going to get married, and he kept putting it off, and then turns out he was actually more interested in her brother, which was good for them, but not for her, because she had set aside 5 years of her life. And so the next man who asked her to marry him at a party after having too many drinks, she said okay, and that was like the worst mistake she could have ever made. But because she had seen one of her sisters go through a divorce and how that sort of ostracized her from society, she was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And I think also part of her trying to separate herself from her sister, who was also a fascist, was that she wasn't going to do anything that her sister did. So, and then she was having some trouble with her career. She was an aspiring writer, but she was only getting paid, £100 as an advance, and she was not really selling out. So she just kind of felt like a failure all over the place, and like she wasn't quite enough of a person. And you see these struggles throughout her 20 years of her adult life. And then finally, when she does escape to something that she wants, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, you'll have to read the book, but she finally gets that part of the thing that she's wanted that brings her happiness. And I think that for a lot of us, we're always kind of like on a path searching for something. And when I was writing this book, so I literally poured everything into this book, because while I was writing this book, in the middle of it, the world shut down, right? COVID. My daughter came home from college. My other 2 kids were sent home from school, and suddenly I had to learn how to do 4th grade math and become like a therapist for a teenager who couldn't play on sports. And then to make matters worse, my husband was stuck in Afghanistan for 6 months, not able to come home. So I was managing all that alone, and it was like my escape into the world was to deal with her life, which seemed way worse than mine. So I don't even know if I answered that question, but that's what the book is mostly about. And then there's a modern timeline, which is basically like who I would have loved to be if I didn't become an author. And we have Lucy, who is a book curator, which I think is the coolest job in the world. And she has been assigned a special project in London in collaboration with Haywood Hill Bookshop, which is where Nancy worked during World War II. And so she's like, well, should I take this leap, because it's a good career move, but at the same time, she wants to figure out this thing that her and her mom have been trying to figure out for her whole life, basically, which is who is Nancy's secret friend. And that's that.
Thank you. And by the way, my questions are just suggestions. You can talk about whatever you want. All right, Janie?
They're great suggestions.
So I told you a little bit about the book already. A young Chinese woman living in Paris, a young French woman who is living in a town called Noyelles-sur-Mer, which is near the Western Front, and which was also the headquarters of the British Expeditionary Forces, which had the companies of Chinese workers that were there. But I also found that this, of all the books that I've written, perhaps reflects sort of the dichotomy of my identity. My parents immigrated to Canada when I was 14, so I'm very, very much Canadian. Before that, my father worked for the UN, so I was born in Taiwan. I lived in the Philippines, in Iran, and in Thailand. I came to Canada. I went to New Zealand, which is where I met my husband, and but Canada is home. But at the same time, I still get questions like, yes, but are you really Canadian? Yeah, and I speak French better than you do. And so for me, the character of Pauline in this novel is sort of like who I am. And I found, towards the end of the book, I was thinking, I really put a lot of myself into this young woman because she is very aware of being culturally Chinese. She's very aware and very proud of her culture and background. But at the same time, she knows if she was ever to go back to China, she would never fit in because she has been too westernized. So a little bit of, standing with one foot in one culture and one foot in the other, and then where would you rather be? And for Pauline, even though she's feeling a little bit guilty about it, she absolutely does not want to go back to China because in those days, it's a very restrictive society for women in 1914 to 1918 kind of thing. And in France, she gets to wander around the streets. She gets to sit in cafes with her cousin and talk to the other students. And yeah, this is a more personal story than others that I've written in many ways.
Thank you, Janie. Kristina.
All right, so I touched on the story a bit. I'll just add a little bit more to it, and I brought props. So I love show and tell. I've never gotten over that since second grade. So in my story, my character Fenna is the mastermind behind an escape show in 1942. And because of her trauma that I mentioned, her skills are very unique. She gets recruited by British military intelligence group, then called MI9, and gets pulled much deeper into the war than she ever expects. Da, da, da. So that's kind of just there. It's part of the story that I was excited to explore that I have rarely seen in fiction was how the Dutch managed to and experienced World War II. The Dutch resistance was incredible, and there were groups even called the Englandvaarders, something like that I thought, how have I not heard about that before? And so those were the people that actually managed to escape German-occupied Netherlands, got all the way over to England, reported everything they knew, and then 80% of them, roughly, went back and dropped back in order to help their country, knowing what they were going back into, and almost none of them survived. So these are people that you think there should be plaques. We should all know about these people, and yet we really don't. So I was very proud to be able to at least shine a little spotlight on that. And so, my prop section. So one of the things that these illusionists created, it makes sense why they were recruited, because they had the same skill set that they were looking for. So for example, there was an illusionist named Jasper Mescaline, and he ended up helping the British Army in MI9, MI5, and 6. He created something called, for example, a map deck. So this just looks like a normal deck. And they'd send these bicycle cards in through the care packages, and of course the Germans thought, oh, we'll let these things in because, of course, keep them busy with pastimes, they won't be busy planning escape. Little did they know that if you take a card like this and you soak it in water for about 2 minutes, it splits apart. And what happens is there is a map that is on the back side. And you take all of the cards in a full deck together, and you can imagine you have a whole region of the area. So pretty brilliant. I could go on and on. They would send in, for example, 3 baseballs. So the reason they sent in 3 is because you had parts of a wireless radio in all 3. You put them together, and that is how they communicated back to London. So the only other thing I'll show you here, and by the way, too, on my website, if you want to see more, I have videos of all the MI9 gadgets I've collected, because they're so fun. This is the fun part of the job. So here is a silk map from World War II. And MI9 helped create these then, and they put these in the Monopoly boards along with 2 files and a compass as well. And the reason that they made them out of silk, which was brilliant at the time, is that you could print color on both sides. It was thin. It would withstand the weather if you were dropped in a puddle in rain. And most importantly, if you were in hiding, it would not rustle and give you away like paper would. So they would take these maps and do things like sew them into airmen's uniforms so that they were down in occupied territory. They immediately had a map that they could rely on. And it goes on and on. Everything on them was hidden just like a magician.
Cool, isn't it?
That is so cool. And I think, one of the things that's so fascinating about researching World War II are the amazing gadgetry and the sort of workarounds that they would use. So I delved really deeply into the French resistance for this research for this book. And especially, like, they would do little things, like, with, like, scraps of silk that they would type on, because the scraps of silk could be burned up really easily. Like, just when you were talking about that, it made me start thinking of all that kind of cool stuff. And it's interesting because with Lyon, France, it was actually the capital of the French resistance. A lot of people think that it was Paris, but it was actually Lyon. And they had these amazing things in Lyon called traboules, which are covered passageways that connect buildings to one another. So you could go into one door and you could go out of another door that was maybe a couple blocks away, which was pretty incredible. And they would use that to be able to have meetings where the Nazis couldn't find them, or if they were trying to escape, etc. But of course, in France, it was incredibly dangerous for everybody there with the Nazi occupation, and especially with people who were making the clandestine press, because the whole point of the clandestine press was to encourage more people to join the French resistance. And so with Elaine's story, it actually starts off with her husband has gone missing, and she's hoping that her efforts with the French resistance will help bring him home faster, or will allow her the opportunity to be able to help him escape in some way. And so that was a really wonderful part of the story for me to kind of share that aspect of the French resistance. And Lisbon, so it's interesting because with Lisbon being neutral, it was very difficult to find books. Usually I love to have dozens and dozens and dozens of research books. But when it came to Lisbon, I had like 5. And then I was trying to just look online. I was getting kind of desperate. And at one point, I found a forum, and it said, tell me about what was happening in Lisbon in World War II. And it had one answer, and it said, there was nothing happening in Lisbon during World War II. It was neutral. That was not helpful. So I was able to bibliography dive, which I think almost all of us authors do, and was able to find some more materials. But I also had the opportunity to get to travel to all the places that I wrote about in my book. So I did get to go to Lyon, and I got to see those amazing traboules. I actually even got to see the actual printing press that the woman who inspired my book had used during World War II. I was actually at the museum for so long, the security guard started following me around. I kind of consider that an honor, I'm not going to lie. And then when I went to Lisbon, that was incredibly helpful since I couldn't get a lot of written material. But while I was there, I had an amazing tour guide, and she had a grandmother who was 101 years old at the time, and she actually remembered when all of the refugees were coming into Lisbon. And I think that's one of the really important aspects of the Librarian Spy, is getting to really share the experience that the Jewish refugees had when they were in Lisbon. So with Lisbon being a neutral area, people would come there to try to escape Nazi occupation in the hopes that they could then move on to, somewhere in Africa or South America or North America, whatever. And oftentimes they would leave with the clothes on their back, and the waits were interminable. You had to get all these different visas. It was a really, really awful experience. And as I was writing this book, everything with Afghanistan was happening, and everybody was fleeing. And reading about the experiences of the refugees coming into America, it really was incredible what a parallel there was between what I had read about the Jewish refugees who were in Lisbon. And I think that really, these are the kind of things that make historical fiction and nonfiction books, all of it, so incredibly important, is sharing these stories that I feel like don't often get a lot of attention. And like what you were saying earlier about like all the kids, it's amazing. You think, how is this not like talked about more? And so for me, that was a really big, important aspect of it. I will say that having to go to Lisbon and Lyon for research, it was hard, but I did it for my book. And I also will say it was funny because my daughter went with me to Lyon, my husband went with me to Lisbon, and then when I wrote my next book and I said, I'm going to do it in Poland, my mom said, dibs.
That's great. Thank you. And I can't believe it because I have so many more questions for you, but we're sadly out of time. And so what I want to say to our virtual audience before we close out our virtual portion of the event is thank you all for attending for the first time our Zoom live stream of SuperBook IV. We're glad you joined us from everywhere across the country and Canada too, I believe. If you want copies, signed copies of the books we talked about today, all you have to do is send an email to events@adventuresbythebook.com and we can get those for you. As long as supplies last, we can send you signed copies. So again, thank you to our virtual attendees. We are signing off on the virtual portion, and have a good night. For the rest of you, we are going to do one more round of book sales and signing because it is really tough to be an afternoon panelist for these events because everybody's tired and they've done their shopping. But we want to make sure that the afternoon authors get their fair time with you as well. So we'll keep the book sales open for a little while, send the authors out to the signing tables one last time. We did find an extra box of Robert Dugoni's books, so we put out a copy for all the authors on your signing tables. Those are yours to keep, and you can get your book signed. And then after all the books are signed and we're done with sales, we'll do our final 7 bags of giveaways. So thank you all for coming. I want all our authors to stand up. One more round of applause for all our amazing authors today. And then if I can ask all our readers to stand up, I'd like our authors to give you a round of applause for coming out today and supporting us. So thank you all. That concludes SuperBook IV, except for your shopping and signing. Please go out there and say hi to all the authors you haven't met yet. Thank you for coming.